What's the scariest real story you have? Story 1. When I was in college during finals week, my two best friends and I would meet up after a long night in the library to relax and go our separate ways for the night. They lived on campus while I lived off campus. I would pick them up in my car when I finished studying, and we'd park down in a large commuter parking lot overlooking a river and woods. It was about midnight, and we were doing the usual, hanging out and listening to music, when we noticed a local police officer driving around with a spotlight in this nearly empty parking lot. Paranoia set in, so we put everything away and waited in silence for him to leave. Eventually he left, and we continued on. All of a sudden, this woman came out of nowhere looking completely disheveled and stopped in front of my car, staring into the windshield at us. Shivers went down my spine. I couldn't understand why she would be doing that. She eventually walked away into the woods. At that point, I was ready to leave, but the one friend out of the three of us who didn't see her directly was convinced we were just imagining things, so we continued to sit there. I was shaking and felt entirely uneasy and unsafe, so I kept looking over my left shoulder behind my car. My friends were joking about how weird it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few minutes later, I had begun to relax a bit, but happened to glance behind my car and saw that same woman sprinting toward the driver's door with something in her hand. My instincts kicked in, and I started the car without saying a word and sped out of the parking lot, not stopping until I was completely off campus. She had crept around all the parked cars in the lot, going around the perimeter to approach my car from behind. Later, we found out the police were looking for her. She had previously harmed her partner and another woman. The police believed she was going to try to steal my car with force. It was hands down the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. My friends would agree. Story 2. I'm 17, at home watching my 11-year-old sister. She's downstairs watching TV or whatever, and I'm upstairs playing video games, getting ready for bed. My sister was and still is pretty awesome, and I could always trust her to go to bed at a decent time. To my surprise, my mom peeked her head into my darkened room, and I cheerfully waved goodnight. I couldn't see her face, just her head poking into the room, looking at me before pulling back. About half an hour later, I went downstairs for some water and was surprised again, this time by my sister, who was still watching the end of her show. I didn't care that she was still up, but my mother would have definitely sent her to bed, as she was much stricter. She asked me if I knew when Mom and Dad would be home, and I immediately took her hand, brought her outside to my car, and we sat there while I called my parents. They came home right away. No doors or windows were unlocked, except for the side door I used to take my sister outside. I still wonder who or what poked its head into my room. Story 3. When I was about 10 or 11, my brother, a friend, and I were playing outside in the backyard. We ended up going near a big pine tree, and my friend found a butcher knife on the ground underneath it, along with a bottle of ketchup and a dead gopher next to it. We told my mom, who called the police. They suspected it might have been connected to a known local offender whose father lived in our neighborhood and who had been seen around the area recently. A couple of nights later, I was fast asleep in my bed. Around 2 a.m., my mom suddenly burst into my room and started yelling out the window, "Get out of here!" It turned out that same individual had been hiding in the tree, and my mom saw him walking through our yard. He ran off after she yelled, and soon after a police car was driving around our road using a spotlight to search for him. We never found out what happened after that, but over 12 years later, I still remember how scared I was. Story 4. My sister and I were very young, and our great uncle, a priest, loved to tell us ghost stories before bedtime. This wasn't your average campfire story either. This was the kind read from a book and took a while. Well, my family stayed with my great uncle every Thanksgiving, and my sister and I had to share a room with 2 twin beds. We moved to the same bed, and my great uncle sat on the other, reading us a new ghost story. Well, this particular time, he read a tale about a man who lost his hand and was given the amputated hand of a murderer to replace it. My great uncle was a storyteller, probably the best I've ever known, and many times during the story, he would do voices and mimic parts with his hands in an attempt to scare us more. In the end, he would close the book and tell us to go to bed. This time, he asked that we pray next to the bed we were both in, and as my sister and I knelt to pray, my mother reached out from under the bed and grabbed both of us. I had no idea she had been there the entire time. To this day, it is one of the most terrifying moments of my life, and they both retell this story at Thanksgiving every year. Story 5. This happened to a friend of mine, and she was so nonchalant about it after it happened. It was a summer night, had to be around 8 or 9 at night. It wasn't too late, and the sun was still setting. She was driving home and stopped at a traffic light that intersected with the highway. We live in a smallish town, so there were hardly any other cars out, and she was literally the only one at the light. Her car was in the lane closer to the left turn lane, one of those 5-lane streets. She was minding her own business, zoning out or whatever, and all of a sudden she hears the passenger door trying to be opened. She looks over and there's a clearly unstable man who had opened the door. So she grabs a drink from her cup holder and throws it at him. It was enough of a surprise to make him back up, and she quickly reached over to shut the door and lock it. He clumsily reached for the door again, and as she looked at his face, she knew he was completely out of it. By this time, the light had already turned green, and while he persisted, she quickly sped away from the intersection. Story 6. I was walking down the street with a friend during college. A woman was driving down the road, and a young girl passed us. She was about 7 or 8, walking a dog, and passed by some bushes that extended out into the street. This was near an old park that hadn't been maintained well. The woman driving didn't see the girl and hit her and the dog. They went in 2 different directions. The way they landed, it was obvious they were gone. One of them made a sickening crunch on impact, but I don't know if it was the girl or the dog. Then the woman got out of the car and started screaming and crying. She kept yelling that she couldn't go to jail and that she didn't see them. I tried to calm her down and told her she wouldn't be arrested because it was clearly an accident, while my friend called for help on her phone. This woman told me to step away from her, so I did because she was hysterical. Then she ran back to her car, removed her purse, and pulled out a gun. She turned it on herself and collapsed on the hood of the car. I was in shock. I had just witnessed 2 lives and an animal lost within seconds. After that, I felt completely numb. A therapist later told me she might have been under the influence, which could explain her reaction. I still think about that little girl and the dog all the time. She would have been around 21 now. Story 7. In 2006, I went to Germany with some friends. I'm from Italy. We had planned to camp in the Black Forest with a group from Germany, a group from Switzerland, and a group from Hungary. Pretty cool, right? Well, one night, some friends and I really had to use the bathroom, but we were terrified to leave our tent because, the Black Forest is pitch black. So we gathered some courage, left our tent, and went together to relieve ourselves. While we were doing the act, a friend and I heard a woman screaming in the distance. We started to panic. We didn't know what to do. What if it was a large animal coming for us? Then an older guy who was with us, I was 13 at the time, tried to calm us down and said it was probably just one animal chasing another, which can happen in a forest that size. So we went back to our tent, feeling okay. The camp was awesome, and we went back to Italy all happy, almost forgetting about that night. Well, a few weeks later, I was home reading online and got curious. I looked up if anything had happened during the summer of 2006 near where we had camped. I found out that around the same period, August 2006, a woman had been found dead just a few kilometers from where we had stayed. Story 8. My dad was in the logging woods at 5:30 a.m. He saw a man on the side of his trail, leaning up against a tree with a bottle of rye whiskey between his legs. An older man in overalls, as I remember my dad telling it. The guy just looked asleep, but since this was deep in the woods, my dad decided to check on him. He started by saying, "Hey, mister," but got no response. He leaned down and began shaking the man's shoulder. Still nothing. Then he went to tap his face, and as soon as his hand made contact, my dad said all the blood drained from his own face, and he thought he might pass out. The man's face was as cold as ice and had a waxy texture. He was very much gone, and my father was completely alone with him, miles deep in the fog-covered woods. Fun epilogue. My dad had a terrible time getting help. It was the 1970s, so there were no cell phones. He was deep in the woods in a predominantly black area in the South alone, and white. He knocked on house after house, but nobody wanted to hear from a random white man in a truck full of chainsaws at 6 a.m. I like to think a lot of people looked out their windows and just said, "Not today." Nope. Finally, a very cautious family opened the door. He asked to use the phone to call the police. The mother handed him the phone through the door and asked what number he wanted to dial. He said, 911, I guess. Cops came and interviewed him for a while and determined the man had wandered off drunk and died of exposure. No foul play. There were no marks on him. He was just sitting there, peacefully, with a bottle of rye. I suppose it's not blood-chilling, but it's the scariest thing I know that didn't turn out to be nothing. It really was a person who had passed away. Story 9. This happened when I was 18 years old. I was working at a bakery, and my co-worker and friend asked me if I wanted to hang out at his place after our shift. I agreed, and we met up at his apartment. As we relaxed, we started talking about bad experiences, and he described a difficult moment he once had, calling it pure emotional torture. He couldn't explain exactly what had made it so bad, just that it felt like he was spiraling, losing his mind, and feeling completely out of control. It clearly still affected him. Eventually, he sat there with his head in his hands and said, "I really wish I could just forget it all." There was a kind of awkward silence, maybe because he felt he'd exposed something too personal. Then out of nowhere, he grabbed his stomach, winced in pain, and dashed to the bathroom. I heard his footsteps sprinting down the hall, followed by a loud crash. I ran in and saw him lying face down on the floor, completely straight with his arms at his sides, rigid like a board. Blood was dripping down the bathtub, and it looked like he had smashed his face. I sat him up and tried to help. His nose and mouth were bleeding all over his shirt. He was disoriented and confused. Soon I realized he had short-term memory loss. Every 30 seconds or so, he forgot everything. He could remember his name and what city we were in, but not who I was, where we worked, or what we had been doing. Even when I explained it to him, he'd forget again within a minute. After about 10 minutes of this, he suddenly vomited all over his bed. I was freaking out, so I called paramedics and went with him to the hospital. I wrote, "Everything is going to be okay," on his hand in marker in case he forgot what was happening. We sat there drawing in my sketchbook until the nurses eventually asked me to leave. The entire time he still had memory loss. But a few days later, I saw him and he was totally fine. We're really close friends now, and we always talk about that night as the moment we truly became friends. There's still such a weird mystery around that moment, how his wish to forget was somehow instantly and violently granted. I still don't know why he ran or how exactly he hit his face. It was like his past trauma just erupted into this bizarre moment of total amnesia. Story 10. I remember when I was a very little girl, I was close to my aunt. She was married to my uncle and they lived downstairs from us in a two-family house. My aunt would always visit me. One day I was sitting in the living room watching TV while my mom, grandma, and uncle were talking at the kitchen table. My uncle was crying. When I asked why, they told me to leave the room. All they said was that his pet bird was sick or something. Later, my aunt came upstairs as usual, but instead of sitting with me and her daughter, she stood in the hallway just waving at me. She wouldn't come out. I thought she was playing and waved back, then turned back to my show. She did this a few times, waving, but never stepping into the room. Eventually, she stopped coming up at all. I asked my mom what had happened to her, and she said my aunt had moved away and broken up with my uncle. Years later, it was the holidays, and I asked about her again. I wondered why she never came to visit my cousin. I was around 12 at the time. My mom and grandma looked at each other, and my grandma left the room. My mom then told me that Aunt Dee had passed away. She had taken her own life when I was 5. She drove out to the beach in winter, knowing it would be empty, got drunk, and overdosed on pills. The police found her car the next day. I didn't understand why she had done it. I told my mom I used to see her in the hallway, and that she would wave and smile at me. My parents didn't believe me. Story 11. Back when I used to live at home with my parents and my sister was still around, maybe 18 or 19 years old, I liked to sleep in. My bedroom was in the basement, so it didn't get much light. One morning I was jolted awake by what sounded like someone yelling my name. I checked the time, it was around 10 a.m., and figured, okay, time to get up anyway. I walked up the stairs from the basement to the entrance of our home, which led to the kitchen, and I saw that our front door was broken. There was a trail of blood leading from it through the kitchen and into the rest of the house. Every horrible scenario immediately ran through my head. It turned out the mailman had startled my dog, and she jumped on the door. The door, being made of glass, shattered. My dog had cut herself and, in fear, ran through the house, leaving a trail of blood. My mom picked her up, and in a panic, we rushed to the vet, hoping the dog wouldn't lose too much blood on the way. You've never felt stressed until someone you love is crying in your back seat, holding someone they love, telling you to drive fast, but then also telling you to drive slow because we couldn't afford to be pulled over and lose time. Then we hit construction and came to a halt. Now the stress shifted to a parent shouting, "We need to find a way around this," which of course there wasn't. In the end, we made it. My dog was okay. My mom was a bit traumatized by the ordeal, and my back seat had a lot of blood in it. It was probably one of the more stressful moments of my life. Luckily, the worst part in the end was just trying to get the stains out of the carpet in the following days. Story 12. I was backpacking around Europe and found myself in Prague. One night I went out alone and realized it was getting late. Time to catch the last trolley back to the hostel I was staying at. It was located pretty far out, at the last stop of the line. It was cheap, but actually a great spot. Unfortunately, I messed up. I got completely turned around, had no idea where I was, and ended up at the end of the line, which was not where I was supposed to be. I got off and found myself in an industrial park. No homes, just office buildings and the occasional sketchy figure emerging from the shadows. I was waiting for a trolley to take me back in the other direction. I even took the SD card out of my camera in case someone tried to rob me. The trolley wasn't coming, and after a while I figured I couldn't just sit there all night. I thought maybe if I walk along the tracks, I'll eventually head back toward the city. Eventually I came to a river, and to follow the tracks I had to cross a bridge. I couldn't understand Czech, but I knew the sign basically said you'd be a fool to cross this bridge on foot. Still, I didn't see another way, and I was pretty sure the trolleys were done running for the night. Halfway across, I felt and heard the rumble. Lights came up behind me. I wasn't going to outrun it. Thinking quickly, I grabbed the railing, jumped over, and clung to the outside of the bridge above the river as the trolley passed. I don't even think the driver saw me. Once it was gone, I climbed back over the railing and got off the bridge as fast as I could. I kept walking through some lower-income suburbs. I saw a group of kids lighting things on fire in a parking lot. They noticed me, and I definitely kept my eye on them. I finally saw a cab, but couldn't explain to the driver where I was trying to go. Then I spotted a guy with a saxophone on his back and thought, someone carrying a sax must be friendly and know where they are. I sped up to catch up with him, but he sped up too. I finally shouted that I needed help figuring out where I was. At first he thought I was trying to steal his saxophone, but he turned out to be kind and helped me figure out where I was. Turns out I was only 2 blocks away from my hostel. Story 13. I've had a lot of messed up and scary things happen to me, but I'll share one I haven't told a million times. My friend and I were walking my dog to the park in our neighborhood. Across the street, we saw a young guy we'd never seen before. He was acting strangely, hitting things, yelling at nothing, and moving aggressively. He crossed the street and started walking toward us. My dog didn't like him at all, which was a big red flag. She liked everyone. We turned and walked away, but he followed us, jerking and twitching like he couldn't control himself. We picked up the pace to put some distance between us. I decided to take the back way because I had seen 2 older guys go that direction and thought they might be some kind of backup if needed. Before we turned the corner, we looked back and saw the guy was sprinting toward us. We ran and caught up to the men and told them what was going on. When we looked back again, the guy was standing near a flagpole at the end of the street, marching in place and screaming with a really disturbing expression on his face. The men told us to go home and not to worry. They walked toward him. I have no idea what happened after that. We never saw that guy again. Story 14. So I'm in the Navy and was deployed back in 2016 during the major operations against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. We had a port call in Bahrain at the time. Some friends and I were walking around the downtown area of the city, just outside the base, and we ended up going down the wrong street. They usually brief us before entering port on which areas are safe and which ones to avoid. The place started feeling a bit sketchy, and I assumed we were drifting into the wrong part of town. It was the middle of the day, so my friends weren't too worried, but I knew that this part of the world could be unpredictable. I was about to convince them to head back when we turned a corner and saw a house with a large flag in the window. It was an ISIS flag. At that point, I grabbed my friends and told them we had to leave immediately. Once they saw the flag, they didn't hesitate. It might not be the most terrifying story, but it scared the hell out of me. ISIS was extremely hostile toward us, especially after the damage we'd inflicted during the previous months. I'm just glad there were no locals around at the time. Things could have escalated very quickly. Story 15. I hear a sound at my late grandfather's house that no one else seems to notice. Anytime I've slept there, it's woken me up at least twice a night. I used to think it was just the central air conditioning making weird noises. One night I stayed up late in the living room and heard it louder than ever, coming from the dining room. I actually jumped out of my seat because it was so loud. It constantly wakes me up. It's that intense. The best way I can describe it is like a large paperback book falling off a table and briefly bouncing on the floor. The first few times I heard it, I was half asleep and blamed it on my cat, even though the cat isn't even at that house. I'd stayed there before and never heard the sound until after my grandfather passed. I know where he died, and it's not exactly where the sound comes from. So at least there's that. It always comes from the dining room. The strange thing is, we rented the house out for 2 months and the renters never complained about it. My family has stayed there too and never mentioned hearing anything. It's very loud, and somehow I seem to be the only person who ever hears it. I still hope it's just the sump pump and I happen to be there when it goes off. But honestly, I really don't know. I've only stayed there a few days at a time, and it's woken me up every single night. Story 16. Back when I lived with my parents, I used to stay out late and usually got home around 2 a.m. One night, I got home and went straight to bed. An hour later, I was woken up by my dad, who was waking up my brother and me, asking us to back him up. I was super confused, grabbed my bat, and followed him to the front door. There was a woman outside, probably in her 20s, crying and banging on our door. Her voice was muffled, but we could just barely make out that someone was chasing her. I ran to check the other windows because my first thought was that it might be a setup to get us to open the door. I didn't see anyone else outside. My dad cracked open a nearby window and began asking her questions. My mom called the police. They told her that a girl matching that description had been reported missing for a few days. Around that same time, the woman started yelling that it was demons chasing her and that a shadow was trying to kill her. We kept talking to her until the cops arrived and took her home. We gave our statement and then went back to bed. Story 17. My wife leaves for work nearly an hour before I do, so she's usually gone before I even get up with the baby, about 1-year-old at the time. I heard her open the door and leave, followed by crashing sounds downstairs. I assumed she had come back in for something she forgot and maybe dropped something in the kitchen. Then, and this was strange, she came upstairs to look in on me and the baby, who were still asleep in bed. I was annoyed because my alarm wasn't set to go off for another 15 minutes, so I pretended to stay asleep. She did whatever she needed to do upstairs, then left again, making more noise on her way out. After my alarm finally went off, I got up to check if she had cleaned up whatever she dropped in the kitchen. That's when I realized that what she dropped in the kitchen wasn't her at all. A hero user, according to the police's theory, had smashed in our transom window, and the person I thought was my wife looking in on us was actually the intruder, realizing the house wasn't empty. I would have easily outweighed that person by over 100 pounds. If I had opened my eyes and seen a stranger staring at my baby instead of assuming it was my wife, I would have panicked and attacked. If they had a weapon, I might not be here today. If they didn't, I might have done something I'd never forget. Story 18. This was strange and filled my body with dread. I was sleeping and woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my dog's collar jingling up and down the staircase. I disregarded it and put my head back down on the pillow, but I started to think, he's going so slowly up and down. Did he get hurt or need something? I sat up and heard the collar coming back up the stairs again. This time it went down the hallway to my parents' room, paused, then came down to my locked door. It stopped right in front. Okay, maybe he laid down. I stood up, and when I did, the tags on the collar began hitting my door at shoulder height, just like knock, knock, knock. I froze. My body was completely filled with dread. I even stopped breathing. After what felt like the longest 10 seconds of my life, the jingling slowly went down the stairs, step by step, then silence. I waited about 5 minutes to see if I heard anything else. My shaky feet and on-edge nerves brought me downstairs, and I checked the dog. No collar. I went to the kitchen table, where we leave it at night so it doesn't wake us, and it was exactly where we had left it. I convinced myself I was just imagining things, but the next morning, my parents came downstairs and asked, "Did we forget to take the collar off the dog?" He woke us up. That's why I'm still questioning what could have really happened. Story 19. The last week of July last year, I went to Ocean City, Maryland, with my boyfriend at the time. The first few nights were great. I got to see a longtime friend who lives there, and he was tagging along with us the night it happened. My boyfriend and my friend decided they wanted to get crab fries. I wasn't interested because I don't like Old Bay on fries. I'm sorry, don't hate me. So I sat on a bench and waited for them. I saw a family walk by, and their daughter was behind them. She looked upset and was texting rapidly, like she was in a heated argument. She had short, bleached white hair and really cool tattoos. That's what made her stand out to me. The tattoos. They were awesome. Anyway, my boyfriend and friend came back, and we ended up walking behind that family for a bit. We got distracted by some boardwalk performers and eventually lost sight of them. I didn't think much of it. Around 2 a.m., we were among the few people left on the boardwalk, other than some small groups of drunk teenagers smoking and shouting. That's when I saw her again. She was running toward the beach, crying. I wanted to go after her and see if she was okay, but my boyfriend advised me to just stay out of it. We went back to our hotel and fell asleep. Around 6 a.m., I woke up, rolled a joint, and quietly left the room. The hotel had a nice sitting area out front overlooking the ocean. I sat there for a few minutes when I saw her again. She was walking down the boardwalk, confused and scared, still crying. I had a weird gut feeling to follow her. I tucked the joint into my clutch and followed her from a distance. She looked nervous, constantly glancing left and right as if she was lost. I followed her to the 2nd Street beach ramp. Suddenly, she broke into a full sprint, crying hysterically. I don't know why, but I shouted, "Hey, wait! Do you need help?" I ran onto the beach and just stood there in shock. No one was there, but I could still hear soft sobbing nearby, to the right of me. I walked in that direction, and then I saw it. Where the sobbing had led me, there was an arm sticking out of the sand. It was her arm. I recognized the tattoos. I'll never forget them. The sobbing stopped, and suddenly the ambient sounds of the beach returned. I hadn't noticed until then, but while I was following her and hearing the crying, everything else had been completely silent. When I realized what I was looking at, I screamed for someone to call 911. A middle-aged couple came jogging up. The wife screamed, and the husband dialed immediately. I didn't have my phone with me. I hate when sand gets into the charging port. The police arrived not long after. When they took my statement, I didn't even know how to explain what had happened. I just told them I had been walking and found her. It took hours to dig her out. When they finally began pulling her out, they asked that all civilians be led away. As we were walking with the police to a nearby area to give more statements, I saw her standing behind them, looking down at her own body. She looked up at me, nodded, and then she was gone. At first, the report said she had sat in a hole that collapsed around her, but later it was discovered that one of the large beach sand cleaners may have unintentionally pushed sand into the hole. The eerie part? She had gone missing around 2 a.m. and died between 2 and 3 a.m. But I saw her. I followed her. The entire time she looked real. I still have dreams about her. I've never forgotten a single detail. Story 20. When I was in high school, there was this little-known place about an hour from my hometown that was popular for cliff diving into water. It was in the absolute middle of nowhere, with the nearest anything being 10 miles away. It was a fun place to go, and it was also known as a spot where people could get away with things like underage drinking. There were cliff jumps ranging from 15 feet to around 80 feet. One of the cliffs, referred to as the tabletop, was about a 40 to 50 foot drop, depending on the water level. This particular cliff had rocks directly beneath it, so you had to jump outward to clear them. If you jumped straight down, you'd hit the rocks. It wasn't hard to clear as long as you pushed off the edge with some forward momentum. You'd keep that outward movement through the fall. I'd never seen anyone come within 10 feet of the rocks before. One day a group of kids showed up and they'd been drinking throughout the day. No one was completely out of it, but they were clearly feeling the effects. Two girls decided to try jumping off the tabletop, but neither had done it before and they were nervous. They decided to hold hands and jump together. As they approached the edge, girl 1 started to panic and stopped right at the lip. Girl 2 tried to slow down since her friend wasn't going, but she couldn't stop in time and ended up teetering over the edge, without any forward momentum. Halfway down, there was a section of the cliff that jutted out slightly, like a belly. She hit that, which slowed her fall a bit, but caused her body to flatten out instead of staying vertical. She hit the edge of the rocks and then rolled into the water. I had seen it all from a cliff about 30 feet across the water. Her body floated to the surface and blood began spreading around her. Multiple people jumped in to help, including me. Others got to her first and pulled her to the shore. She had a large gash on the side of her head, cuts on her elbows, and was unresponsive for about 90 seconds. It felt like forever. I ran roughly half a mile just to get enough cell service to call an ambulance. It took about 20 to 30 minutes for help to arrive because of how remote the area was. In the end, she ended up with cuts, soreness, and a severe concussion. She's perfectly fine now, but that was about 8 years ago. It was terrifying. As a high schooler, I truly thought I had just watched someone fall to their death. I still have nightmares about it every now and then. She was incredibly lucky. Story 21. When I was younger, I was almost abducted by an older man. I had errands to run, so I was out when it was already pretty dark due to winter. As I was walking, this man stopped me and tried to strike up a conversation. He claimed I had done something that I hadn't, and then tried to take me by the hand and pull me somewhere away from the street. Me, being a bit bold, told him, politely but firmly, to back off and broke free from his grip. I noticed some people walking nearby and shouted to them. Luckily, he got the message and backed off, never to be seen again. I was probably very close to becoming someone who was never seen again too. At the time, it didn't feel that scary, but looking back now, it's disturbing how easily someone can just disappear. The other experience is more mild. My friend and I decided to try contacting spirits in my basement. He was preparing the setup, candles, a needle, and a makeshift Ouija board, while I was holding his phone to use as a flashlight. Out of nowhere, the phone died, leaving us in complete darkness. We hadn't even started yet. Apparently, the battery just dropped with no warning, because when he plugged it in later at home, it worked fine. Moral of the story, don't mess with spirits. They'll drain your battery. Story 22. Probably not the scariest thing on here, but this happened to me yesterday, and I'm still pretty shaken up about it. I was leaving my significant other's apartment around 11 p.m. People leave their trash cans out overnight for maintenance to collect, so as I was walking down the hall, there were trash cans and some trash just sitting out like usual. I passed one and did a double take because sitting next to the trash can was a pile of odds and ends, including a big glass jar that I immediately thought would be perfect for storing things. I assumed someone had put it out for trash. I picked it up and entered the stairwell. Suddenly, the door slammed open behind me. A guy, some man in his 20s with really long brown hair, was screaming at me for stealing his stuff. For reference, I'm a 5'4" female, so my internal danger alarms were going off like crazy. I handed the jar back and said, "Sorry, I thought it was trash." He shouted that it was from his storage unit and screamed, "You're what's wrong with this place?" I started freaking out. He was beyond angry. I ran down the stairwell to get away, but I could still hear him following and yelling. I dashed out into the parking deck and ran a few steps before realizing he could still see me if I kept going. I ducked behind a car, crouched and hid. I heard the door slam open again, and he was still screaming, "Thief! You're the problem here!" I was terrified and crying. I heard him walk a little farther, then it went quiet. Eventually, I heard the door close. I waited about 15 minutes, still crouched behind that car, before pulling out my phone and calling my SO to come walk me the rest of the way. Story 23. This happened to my mom. We used to live in a rough part of town. One night, around 11 p.m., my mom was sitting on the front porch talking to her friend on the phone. She said she thought she saw something near the car, and for about 10 to 15 minutes while on the call, she kept her eyes on that spot. Then she looked away for just a second, and that's when a tall man stepped out from behind the car and stared directly at her. My mom is a smaller woman, only 5 feet 2 inches, and she said this man must have been at least 6 feet 5 inches. She jumped up and ran to the door. Just as she barely got it closed, she saw that he was already really close. If she had been even 1 second slower, he could have caught her, or worse, gotten inside the house with us kids. She quickly locked the front door, but then remembered the back door was open to help cool the house. She bolted to the back door, and again, she was just in time. He was there too, trying to come in through the back. Story 24. When Pokemon Go first exploded in popularity, my wife, her brother, and I decided to drive to downtown Huntsville, Alabama. We were walking around enjoying the night when a man approached us and asked if we could spare a few bucks. He said he had just gotten out of jail. I told him I didn't carry cash, and he went on his way. That had me on edge for the rest of the night. He didn't seem dangerous, but just realizing how vulnerable we were made me more alert. About an hour later, I noticed a different, younger guy walking around without a phone. That struck me as odd, especially since most people were playing the game. Still, I figured maybe he just lived nearby. Eventually, we let our guard down again and decided to venture away from the park. That same guy started following us. We turned around halfway down a street. He stopped and waited, then got behind us again when we turned back. This went on for a few minutes. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw him reaching into his waistband. I knew what was about to happen. Without turning directly toward him, I raised the back of my shirt to reveal my Beretta. That was the last thing I wanted to do, but he had made his intentions clear, and he was making a move. I've never seen anyone disappear so fast. After that, we got out of Huntsville and never went back out at 1 a.m. to play Pokemon Go again. And before anyone says anything, I had a permit, I did everything I could to avoid the situation, and I had a wife to protect. I don't know if he had a weapon or not, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. Story 25. I live in a pretty rough area, and unfortunately, I have a mother who didn't think it was important to invest in home security devices or take care of our old house. That's kind of important for this story. I got home one day and noticed that my window was open. I had it locked, but it was such an old window that I think it was just propped shut with minimal effort. It was summer, so at first I thought maybe my mom had opened it, but that wasn't the case. I looked around my room and thankfully noticed that my laptop was safe and sound on the bed. Cool. My PS3 was still there, the TV too, but then I saw that my drawers had been rummaged through. And what was missing? All my undergarments. Bra, underwear, lingerie. I freaked out. It was terrifying that nothing else of actual value had been taken. Just that. I spent the night at a friend's house because I was genuinely scared. Fast forward about a year. I met a guy on a dating app and he came to my house to pick me up. My car was parked outside. I spent pretty much the whole day with him, and when I got home, the same thing had happened again. I was devastated and called the police. I mentioned the car being out front because I think it's terrifying that someone broke in knowing I wasn't home, or possibly hoping I was. Cops came and took a report, but they never caught whoever did it. It's horrifying to know someone is so obsessed that they'd break in just to steal that kind of thing. And that they did it twice? I get goosebumps just remembering. I know some people might think I'm making this up. It sounds insane, but I have a post on Facebook about the incident and messages from people who reached out afterward. It was real and it was terrifying. Story 26. One time I was waiting in my car while some friends went into Starbucks. We had just picked up groceries and I had gotten some sushi from the store. While eating, I accidentally had a piece that was way too spicy from touching too much wasabi. It was so hot I opened the door to spit it out. I sat back up and closed my door, and that's when I saw a man approaching my car from the opposite rear side. He looked Asian and came up to the passenger window, knocking and motioning for me to roll it down. At first I thought maybe he was checking on me, thinking I had just thrown up. But he didn't say anything, just kept knocking and signaling for me to talk to him. I waved him away and said no. I had a weird gut feeling, uneasiness, distrust. Then he walked around to the driver's side and tried to open my door. Thankfully, I had just locked it. I panicked and immediately backed out with him still next to my car. I didn't even check if it was safe to pull out, just reparked elsewhere and tried to call my friends. He left me alone after that, but got into a car with another man who looked Middle Eastern. Both of them were wearing earpieces. My gut was telling me it felt like a trafficking or kidnapping setup. I was seriously shaken. When my friends came out, we started driving home, and we ended up behind the same car at a traffic light. My guy friends, being protective, yelled out the window to confront them, but they completely ignored us. As soon as the light turned green, they sped off, like 60 miles per hour, onto a different freeway. I called the police and reported the license plate. Story 27. I have a couple of strange experiences. When I was little, my parents took my brothers and me down to Mexico to visit some friends. We ended up at a beach that was kind of off the beaten path. Down the way there was a little kid, couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl, with a rag doll in a stroller. The kids saw me and their eyes widened like they were going to charge. They started running at me. My parents were farther away, but my older brothers were nearby. My oldest brother stepped in front of me and stomped his foot, trying to intimidate the kid. It worked. They backed off and walked away. But the way that kid looked at me, I seriously thought something bad was going to happen. Years later, I had another odd moment. I was driving to the police station to get my gun permit. Unbeknownst to me, the station had moved and my GPS sent me to the wrong place. I pulled over to get my bearings, and while I was sitting there, a man stood right next to my door like he was finishing a cigarette. I ignored him and kept searching my phone. Suddenly, he opened my door and started climbing into the car, even dropping his bag into the passenger footwell. I panicked and started yelling at him to get out of my car. He quickly realized something was wrong and scrambled back out. I shut the door, locked it, and drove off. At the time, I was freaked out, but a year later it hit me. The guy probably thought I was his Uber, and I completely scared the life out of him. Story 28. When I was around 12, my dad owned a lumber business, and my neighborhood friend's dad was a contractor. We all liked to skateboard, so one day my dad donated the lumber needed to build a 6-foot half pipe in our backyard, and my friend's dad built it with our help. One day I left my skateboard out there, and when I went to retrieve it, I was shocked to find a homeless man sitting on the other side of the ramp, eating a crab apple, which I'm not even sure are edible. He asked me why I had broken into his house and started accusing me of all kinds of wild things. I kept telling him that I just wanted my skateboard. Even at 12, it was obvious this guy wasn't in a good state of mind. I rushed for my skateboard and he lunged at me, grabbing the back of my jacket. I slipped out of the jacket and leapt from my board. I grabbed it and blindly swung it behind me, the metal trucks connecting directly with his face. He hit me a few times before collapsing, blood everywhere. I just wiped myself off and went home. I never told my parents, my friends, or the police. I'm not sure why. I was a kid and who knows what my logic was back then. I never saw a body or any sign of him after that, so I don't know what happened. Hopefully he just left and found another spot to stay. Story 29. This was probably the scariest experience of my life, and it left me paralyzed with fear for months. It happened about 11 years ago when I was around 12. We were living in an apartment building in a small city called Sakaka in Saudi Arabia. Every afternoon around 2, my dad would pick me and my mom up from school. She was a teacher. After we got home, I would go get bread, cubs, from a nearby store. In the summer, at that time of day, the temperature would reach around 50 degrees Celsius, and the streets were completely deserted except for maybe a car or two. I went to the store and was heading back home when I saw a small red Jeep parked just outside our apartment entrance. I didn't think much of it and went inside to take the stairs. Our flat was on the first floor. Inside the lobby was a large man, probably in his late 20s, wearing a vest and lounge pants. He was standing near the electricity board. He was heavy, had short hair and a mustache, and smelled strongly of tobacco. I started climbing the stairs and he looked at me and said, "Salam." I responded politely. Then he moved toward me and asked if I was Hindi. I said yes. Then he said something I didn't quite understand, but it sounded like he was offering me money. I told him I already had money. Then he said more clearly, "I want to give you money," and placed his hand on mine on the stair railing. That moment triggered something in me. I pulled my hand back and quickly started jogging up the stairs. About 10 steps up, I turned and saw him running after me, 2 stairs at a time. I tripped, fell, and screamed, "Mom!" as loud as I could while scrambling up the rest of the steps. When I looked back, expecting to be grabbed, I saw him fleeing back down the stairs, panicked by my scream. I ran to our flat and just then my dad burst out with an iron rod in hand, yelling. I ran to him and shouted, "A man tried to grab me." I wasn't crying, but I was shaking like crazy. My legs gave out and I fell to the ground. My dad picked me up and took me back upstairs. I didn't eat dinner that night. I just went to bed, terrified. I woke up sweating and scared. I went to the kitchen, took a small knife from the drawer, and kept it in my pocket. I didn't go out alone for 2 months. I never told my parents what the man really wanted, but I think they knew it wasn't just a random encounter. They stopped asking me to get groceries and didn't pressure me when my school grades dropped. For months, I kept an eye out for a small red Jeep. I always had the knife on me, ready to defend myself. That's how scared I was. I was willing to fight for my life, even in a country where serious consequences follow such actions. We eventually moved back to our home country. Life might not be easy here, but at least I feel safer. Story 30. About a year and a half ago, I was walking home from the library around 2:30 a.m. after a late-night study session. I was completely exhausted from a marathon of studying and wanted nothing more than to get home and fall asleep. Normally, I'd be terrified of walking alone that late at night. As a woman, I'm always cautious. But I decided to take a shortcut through a sketchy area. As I was walking through, a homeless man suddenly began chasing me. He cornered me near an old building and pulled out a knife. He was screaming things like, "You stupid, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to murder you," getting closer and closer. I was paralyzed with fear. It's hard to describe what it felt like. I was frozen. The only things I can clearly remember are his greasy blonde hair and the panicked thoughts racing through my mind. Maybe if I give him my wallet, he'll leave. But wait, how will I write my exam tomorrow without my ID? Maybe I can ask him to keep my student card. I was extremely lucky. A group of 3 guys happened to walk by. 2 of them threw him to the ground and called the police, and the third one walked me home to make sure I got there safely. My roommate let me sleep in her bed with her that night because I couldn't stop shaking. To this day, I never walk through that area anymore. Ever. Story 31. Let's set the scene. It's summer, early 2000s. I was around 10 or 12 years old. My best friend, who lived next door for most of my childhood, told me she knew a cool place with lots of cats. Being an animal lover, I was excited. It was just a short walk down the main road we both lived on. The house we visited looked pretty normal. Small, white, with black shingles. But I didn't know the people who lived there. I was a shy and cautious kid. My mom always warned me that strangers don't always have good intentions. We met a woman who looked like she was in her 50s or 60s. She took us behind the house to an old shed. For reference, my house was about 30 yards from the road. Hers was about 100 yards, and the shed was another 30 yards behind that. Even at that age, I was uneasy. Something felt off. When she opened the shed, cats of all ages scattered like rats. At first, it seemed magical. I started to feel more relaxed. We played with the cats, but most of them looked sick, pus around their eyes and noses. They were feral outdoor cats. There was even a dead kitten. She picked it up, said something like, "Oh no, I like that one," and threw it in the trash. About 20 minutes later, I started feeling uneasy again. I felt bad for the cats, but I wanted to go home. Then her husband came out from the back of the house. He looked like he was also in his 50s or 60s, clean-shaven, wearing a white shirt with black suspenders. He said, "Ooh boy, sure is a scorcher. You girls want to come down and have a popsicle?" My friend, being kind of naive, ran up toward the house. I followed, mostly to stop her. She walked into the house, but I stopped at the doorway. He was trying to lead us into the basement. Every instinct I had told me this was a very bad idea. I grabbed her arm tightly and didn't let go. "You know, my mom is probably worried. We didn't tell her where we were going." "We should go," I said, pulling her away. She was really mad at me. I gave her a popsicle from our own freezer when we got back and told my mom everything. She forbade us from ever going over there again. Fast forward 6 years. We heard that the same man who tried to lure us into his basement had taken a young boy and committed a horrible crime. I don't know if that was what he had in mind for us, but I will never forget the feeling of looking down those basement stairs and knowing it was a trap. Story 32. I was 18, in the Navy, and away from my parents for the first time. I often planned the night's activities. We went out about 6 or 7 nights a week. There were times when some of us were still drunk on the parade deck the next day. After a couple of months of this, I was pretty worn out but still went out anyway. We always stuck together and went to our usual bar, which had become our favorite hangout spot. I had 3 drinks. By the second, I had gotten separated from my group. 2 guys started hanging out with me. I was feeling fuzzy. I tried to find my friends, but they blocked me from leaving and gave me another drink. The next thing I knew, I was in a car. They were driving for a long time, talking about partying. We arrived at a house with wood floors and a fireplace. One of the guys seemed to be the leader and was loud and aggressive. The other was quiet and seemed more subdued. He laid me on the couch, which was weirdly the only furniture in the room. I think I fell asleep. Then I heard the loud one saying, "Get her up to do some lines." I've never done drugs. I said, "No, I don't do that." He replied, "Fine, whatever." Things got fuzzy again. Then I heard him say, "Take her pants off. We're going to do her." The quiet guy came over and started undoing my pants. Through the haze, I kept my eyes shut and said as loudly as I could, "I'm on my period. You can't do this. Are you trying to hurt me?" The loud one exploded. "Are you kidding me? We went through all this, spent money, and now you say that? Get her out of here before I lose it." Somehow I was walking, even though I couldn't feel my legs. The quiet one asked, "Where do you live?" I said, "The base." He looked shocked. "What? Like the Navy base?" I said yes. He said, "Oh no. I'm so sorry. Don't worry about him. Nothing happened." I was slowly coming out of the fog, realizing the danger I was in. I pretended not to remember much. I said, "Thanks for the ride back from the bar," as if nothing had happened. He calmed down and drove me 30 minutes to the base. "You have to show ID to get in." We were waved through. He kept apologizing and begged me not to say anything. Then he left. I told my group what happened. I was furious they left me alone. I never went out with them again. When I did go out after that, I stayed sober and kept a close eye on the other girls. Once I saw those 2 guys again, I told them to get out of my bar and never come back. After 2 months of partying, I had built a tolerance. They were separating girls from their friends and drugging them. I don't know why I didn't report it immediately. Maybe I thought I'd get in trouble. I was young and naive. I even felt sorry for the quiet one. But I still had the wits to lie about my period and stop them. I outsmarted 2 predators. Story 33. There was a house across the street from where I lived. An elderly couple lived there, and they were always quiet and kept to themselves. Recently, their grandson and his girlfriend had moved in with them, both of whom I went to high school with at the time. One night, I came home late after hanging out with some friends and noticed the lights in the house were on. It looked like someone was leaving in a hurry. I saw the grandson and his girlfriend leaving the house carrying bags. I waved since I knew them, but they didn't wave back. I thought that was strange, but didn't give it too much thought. 2 weeks later, I came home from work and saw fire trucks and ambulances all over the block. They found the grandfather deceased in the home, reportedly from a heart attack, but the grandmother was missing. It turns out the grandson and his girlfriend had killed the couple. The grandfather had been smothered and the grandmother was stabbed. The bags I saw them carrying? Apparently they were filled with body parts. They had dismembered the grandmother and were attempting to bury her elsewhere. The murders were driven by a meth binge and desperation for money. It was a huge deal in our small town, even made the national news. The craziest part? A year before that, I went to homecoming in a group, and that same girl was part of our group. Before she got involved in drugs, she seemed like just a regular teenager. It's surreal to think someone you once laughed and danced with was capable of something like that. Story 34. We lived about 5 minutes away from BTK, though we only found that out later when he was caught. He was all over the news, so everyone in the area was on high alert. He had taken a decade-long hiatus and suddenly came back into the spotlight when he started sending letters to local news stations. At the time, I was a freshman in high school, one of 5 children. One evening, our parents went out for a date night. About an hour after they left, my older brother came running up the stairs in a panic, saying the house phone had no dial tone. We checked all the phones in the house, and sure enough, no dial tone. We remembered the news saying that BTK would cut the phone line so his victims couldn't call for help, and we completely panicked. My brother had me gather our younger siblings, who were already asleep, while he grabbed the sharpest knives from the kitchen. We sat together in the living room in a circle, and he gave each of us a knife and a pep talk, basically saying, "If you see him, do whatever it takes to protect yourself." It was an incredibly tense moment. My younger siblings were crying, and I was absolutely convinced we were all going to die that night. Every sound made us flinch. After what felt like an eternity, probably only 10 minutes, our parents came home. At first, our dad was angry that the younger kids were still awake, but he quickly calmed down when he realized how terrified we all were. He walked through the house and around the outside, reassuring us that we were safe. As for the dead phone line, we had recently gotten new phones, and if one handset was left off the cradle, it would disable the dial tone for all the others. Months later, when BTK was caught, we were shocked to learn he had been living so close to us all along. Story 35. When I was in my early 20s, my fiancé and I moved into a new townhouse apartment in a town that, at the time, had an active serial killer. It was later revealed there were actually 2 serial killers operating independently. But during this story, everyone believed the murders of several young women were the work of one. I knew about it, but I was in my 20s and, like many people that age, felt invincible. We hadn't moved our washer and dryer in yet, so I was using the laundry room provided by the apartment complex. I was in school and working, so it was pretty late when I headed back with a full basket of clothes. Our townhouse was the last one in the row, furthest from the laundry room. I had my headphones in and was completely oblivious. When I walked in the front door, I didn't notice anything unusual and went straight upstairs. My fiancé, who was in the kitchen, which faced the front door, looked up and saw a man dressed in black following me inside. He screamed and ran at the man, who bolted out the door and vanished into the night. I'll never know who that man was. Maybe it was one of the serial killers, or maybe it wasn't. But I believe with everything in me that if my fiancé hadn't been there that night, something truly terrible would have happened. Story 36. In the 90s, my country went through a devastating conflict. There were horrifying tactics used during that time, many of which I didn't believe until I heard them firsthand from my uncle, a war veteran. I don't want to name the country or go into political details, as this story isn't about who was right or wrong. It's about what war does to people. According to my uncle, there were horrifying incidents where civilians, especially women and children, were forced into being carriers of explosives. They weren't just strapped with them. These people had their tongues removed so they couldn't speak. A surgical cut would be made in their lower torso, and an improvised explosive device would be hidden inside. These victims were then sent past military checkpoints. Once they entered their intended target location, whether a base or a checkpoint, the bomb would be detonated remotely. The reason many of them complied was because their children or parents were being held hostage. It's one of the most horrific things I've ever heard. My uncle told me about one woman in particular, someone he knew from a local village. She had been rigged with a bomb. She stumbled across the road weeping. When the soldiers asked her to stop, she wouldn't. They couldn't risk letting her get any closer. One of the snipers took her down. My uncle said he collapsed afterward, pulling at his own hair in anguish. It was an unsolvable situation. Either let her in and risk everyone's lives, or stop her and know her family would likely suffer. 2 years later, my uncle took his own life. He had told us many stories, but that one stayed with me the most. I believe him. He was honest, and he carried the weight of everything he had witnessed until the end. Story 37. When I was a kid, our kitchen window gave a clear view of the entire kitchen, with the sink facing away from it. The window was on the side of our house, about 15 feet from the neighbors. My mom always left this window unlocked, and the blinds were always open. It bothered me for some reason. I just felt like a neighbor or some random person could easily look in or climb in. Our house had been burglarized a year earlier by some neighborhood kids. They had come in through the garage, but this window still felt like an easy access point. So I'd always close and lock it and shut the blinds. I'd complain to my mom about it, but she always brushed me off like it was no big deal. One night, I was at a school dance, and my friend's mom offered to drop me off at home. As we pulled up, we stopped in a position where I could clearly see the area outside the kitchen window. Crouched low in dark clothes was a person peering in. My immediate reaction was to jump out of the car and sprint toward them. They must have heard the car door open because they bolted down the dark alley behind the house. I was yelling, running after them, but they got away. I went inside, and there was my mom at the sink, washing dishes, completely unaware that someone had just been a few feet away, watching her through the open window. I calmly walked over, closed the blinds, locked the window, and told her never to open it again at night.